when it feels like you've lost your way and the road disappears in the haze, when your fading heart needs a northern star, I'll walk with you to the other side.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Wednesdays with Watson. It is July of 2024, and you are in for a little bit of a different experience if you are a regular listener to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. Over the next 2 months, over July and August, we are going to put the podcast on hiatus. However, we are going to re-release some episodes from the first season that most of you probably have not heard. And so we're going to combine some of these episodes, many of which I left off on a cliffhanger. So back in the day, people had to wait 2 weeks to find out the rest of the story. As you're listening to what we are going to share with you today, just keep in mind who you hear talking to you right now and how unbelievably faithful God has been. Because even when I look back to 4.5 years ago when I recorded these episodes, I am such a different person. So much healing, so much hope, so much growth. And part of that has been because of this, which had become a bit of a passion project for me, the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. But most of it is because of my church, my community, and counseling, which from the very beginning became the tagline for this podcast, along with Jesus, who is the star of my story. And so as you listen to these first set that we're going to drop today, we will be doing that all through July and August. And you will know, if you're a new listener, why all of these things matter to me. As for me, during July and August, I will be behind a computer getting my dissertation proposal ready. As some of you know, I am all but dissertation done with my doctorate degree in educational psychology with a focus on trauma and community care. I'm looking forward to what that means for the podcast. We have brand new content and a brand new format coming at you in September. And so until then, though, especially for those of you that are new, enjoy these drop back episodes so that we can see how faithful God is. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Wednesdays with Watson. It is Wednesday, and if you have been following the podcast, you know that I am Amy Watson and I am your host, and we record these episodes every Wednesday, so you may be listening to it on a different day, but either way, thank you. I am so appreciative of the time that you have decided to invest. I've been so excited about the podcast in general and some of the communication that I'm getting with people via email and social media. And if you hang on to the end of the podcast, you'll see all of the ways that you can get in contact with me. I am super excited about today. In this first season, our podcast, PTSD, Jesus and Me, where Jesus is the star of my story, as well as trauma-informed counseling, as well as my community. And speaking of community, one of the reasons why I'm so excited today, and this name will not be at all unfamiliar to those of you who have been listening to the podcast, but I am so excited to welcome our very first guest on Wednesdays with Watson, my friend, my sister, my business partner, Chrissy. Hey, Chrissy, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, I'm excited to be here.
I am so excited to welcome you to the podcast. And so I just wanted first, before I started into a little bit of the teacher mode, and then we're going to have a conversation about why you're on the podcast today. We've called this Memory Keeper because, as I will talk about in some of the science of PTSD, memories are often different than as they actually occurred. And so the Lord had placed you in an opportunity to be a memory keeper for me in so many ways. But I wanted to start out because you are an Old Testament fan, am I right?
I am.
You know, that's always confused me about you.
I love the Old Testament.
I always used to say, but Jesus isn't in the Old Testament, but he kind of is.
He is. It just looks different.
Yeah.
It's the promise of him coming.
But early in those days, and some of the stories that these guys have already heard, you shared a special psalm with me. And I just want you to tell us before we start into some of the science of this, and then after the science, the really cool part of conversation that we've already recorded about how you're my memory keeper, and I'm so grateful for that. Tell me what psalm that was.
So we were in the same Sunday morning class, and I got the opportunity. I say opportunity, but really I was scared.
You were terrified.
I was terrified.
I was sitting next to you. I remember that.
I got the opportunity to teach one morning, and it was a summer in Psalms, and I taught on Psalm 91, and it's always been a favorite of mine. Really, it hit home for me when I was 24, and I went on a Young Life wilderness hiking trip, and it was a week long, and you're completely out of touch with all of humanity, but certainly can't get word out if you're in trouble.
Right.
And the entire week, I was extremely ill, and we were climbing mountains, hiking 30 miles. It was very intense, and it was gorgeous, and I was sick. But there was no way for my mom to know that. But the whole time I was there, she was praying Psalm 91 over me, and especially verses 5 and 6. You will not be afraid of the terror by night, or the arrow that flies by day, of the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, or of the destruction that lays waste at noon. And it was a battle, day, night, noon, it didn't matter. I was battling. And so often I feel like these verses are appropriate for PTSD.
Yeah.
It's different battles. It's the terror by night. It's an arrow that flies by day. And so it's been appropriate my whole life, and even more so now.
Wait. By the way, I didn't know the answer to that question, and the fact that your mom prayed that over you, I might not have even remembered that, and that's precious for its own reasons. But yeah, I've dubbed it the PTSD prayer because those verses that you just read really describes the day from morning to night of a post-traumatic stress disorder patient. And so thank you for introducing me to that psalm. I'm going to start really quickly, and some of these things, Chrissy, you'll recognize. I know sometimes you'll text me and go, what was that again? That because we both learned this initially from Dr. Pettit, and then, of course, I've done my research. But we're going to be talking hippocampuses and amygdalas here for just a few minutes before you jump back on with me. And the reason why I want to do that is because the reason why on this first podcast you're here is to help me unjumble some memories. And so in order for our listeners to understand why that matters is, why do you need to help me unjumble those memories? And so here I go into teacher mode, and then I can't wait to continue our conversation. You guys know that I love playing both the role of storyteller, and also the goal of this podcast is to educate you about post-traumatic stress disorder or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The only difference really in those two diagnoses being that complex post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of repeated trauma over a long period of time, which is what I have, but the symptoms are the same. And so before I bring Chrissy on, and I've got a very special reason for doing that today, one of the goals of this podcast is to talk about and share with and bring on people who have been instrumental in my healing story. And that is what this is. This is a healing story. Sometimes it's hard to listen to, but I always encourage people, you hear my voice, you can go to my website, you can see my smile, you know that I am good. Doesn't mean life is always easy, but that I am on the other side of my journey with post-traumatic stress disorder, or at least given it a nice gut punch and nice body blow. As I always mention, there are 3 components, and because I'm a writer, I love an alliteration, hence the Wednesdays with Watson, and then also the 3 C's that are central to anything that I am trying to do here. And that is my church, my community, and also trauma-informed counseling. So as we've talked about post-traumatic stress disorder over the last several weeks, we have talked about different hallmarks of post-traumatic stress disorder, the last one being flashbacks, but disassociation, detachment. We talked about all of those things, and no doubt if you are a patient of post-traumatic stress disorder, whether you've been diagnosed or not, you recognize some of those things. If you love somebody with PTSD, you recognize some of the things that we've talked about. Today I want to talk about something that is super interesting and super fascinating, and something that Chrissy brought up to me as she was listening to the podcast over the last few weeks. But before I begin that story, and before I bring her on to tell her part of the story, I want to be your teacher for just a second. As a kid who raced home to watch Emergency every day after school and every medical drama and everything, I always wanted to be a doctor. Took every class to be a doctor, have an undergrad degree to be a doctor, but then sick people make me sad, and so I am not a doctor. However, I love the study of these things, and so I want to help you understand two things, really important things that happen in trauma patients, and even some understanding as to why sometimes the same traumatic event can affect a person and manifest itself in post-traumatic stress disorder. And then some people can look at that exact same event and not be affected by post-traumatic stress disorder. This is also my opportunity to weekly remind you to remember not to compare your pain. Don't compare it with mine. Don't compare it with your sisters. Don't compare it with your cousins. Your pain is yours. The grace that God has for you is for your pain and your pain alone, and mine alone. So please do not compare. There's two components to our brain that is associated with memory and that trauma affects. And those two organs are buried deeply in two different parts of the brain, so deeply, in fact, that one of them is difficult to get to. As a matter of fact, if you had a tumor on this, the doctors would say to you, it's better off of not digging in the middle of your brain to address this issue. There are two parts of the brain. One is the hippocampus and one is the amygdala. Now, the hippocampus, its physical location is very, very difficult to get to, as I mentioned, but it has a bunch of jobs in life. But as it pertains to trauma, the hippocampus is actually the physical location where memories are stored. And so we will witness something or we will see something, say, like one of my favorite memories of all time as a Jaguars fan is the first time we went to the playoffs. And Morton Anderson, who played for the Atlanta Falcons at the time, Mr. Automatic. And all he had to do was hit this chip shot, like this 22-yard chip shot field goal, and the Jaguars were lost. But if he missed it, we were going to go to the playoffs in just our second season. And I will never forget where I was when I watched Morton Anderson, who is now in the Hall of Fame, miss that field goal. My hippocampus took that really pleasurable memory, and basically the hippocampus's job, one of its jobs in life, is to direct memories where to go. And that is one of my strongest memories. So the hippocampus then directed it to the amygdala. And the amygdala is the real warrior in the fight against post-traumatic stress disorder. Because what the amygdala does is it took that memory and it decided whether it had interpreted it. So it interpreted it and manifested itself physically in a very positive, a very happy memory. So the amygdala is the real warrior. Now, we know that trauma affects both of these organs by shrinking them, thereby decreasing their efficacy to at first bring in the memory and then interpret the memory. And so you'll see a lot of post-traumatic stress patients interpret a memory as traumatic that isn't traumatic at all, because the actual size of that organ has shrunk as a result of trauma. Or recent studies have shown some people are just born with smaller amygdalas and hippocampuses, which may explain why some people are affected by trauma and some are not. Now, I bring all of this up to you because both of these are really important in how we lay down memories and how we interpret those memories and how we can report those memories back at a later date. Trauma, without a doubt, absolutely affects both of these organs. This is where the fight or flight comes in and some of the neuroplasticity stuff that we'll talk about when we bring Dr. Pettit on. But essentially, the reason why I explained those two things to you and those two organs to you is because they do affect the way we lay down memories. And it is the reason why a lot of times a trauma victim, say, for example, will get on the stand in a court of law and they will literally not be able to remember parts of it. And the person will get off because they thought that they'll say the offender, the person that attacked him, had a red shirt on with blue jeans, and maybe he had white shorts and a t-shirt. But because of the way the trauma affected the amygdala and the hippocampus, things get left out, things get misplaced, things get jumbled. And so this is where I bring Chris in, because emotional memory processing is by these two organs that when they are shrunk, when they are not the size that they need to be, whether we're born that way or trauma has made it that way, it absolutely makes memories weird. And so as Chrissy, who is one of my beta listeners, has listened to the podcast over the last couple weeks, every single one of them, she came to me and said, hey, this is how I remember it. And over the course of several weeks, we realized that I am, in fact, exhibiting exactly what I'm explaining to you, where both of these organs in my brain, as a result of repeated trauma over 35 years, have been affected. And so Chrissy is my business partner. She is my sister. She is my friend. She is a bunch of stuff to me, likely. And as you've heard on the other podcasts, she was instrumental in so many things. And so welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you doing this. Everybody who knows me knows how much I love you and how much I appreciate you and how much the Lord really has used you in my life. And I referred to you last week. I'm not sure which one is Jonathan and David. No, actually, I know which is which. You are Jonathan because you continue to give me your battle gear. And you did during those times. And so I want to bring you in on this for this podcast for sure, and probably the next one, because we want your perspective. Many people have emailed me or texted me or interacted with me on social media, and they said, you're helping me understand somebody I live with post-traumatic stress disorder. And right now, Chris, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of racial tensions. And so there's no doubt that PTSD is going to be on the rise. You don't have to have a story like mine to have PTSD. Right now, you just need to turn on the news. And so the mission more than ever is to bring people on also who love patients of post-traumatic stress disorder, who will walk with them, because it, like any other mental illness, is very difficult for everyone. Most often the person who is not medicated, who has not been through the trauma, it is hard for everyone. And so as I was praying about this podcast and bringing you on, I remembered a movie that you introduced me to that happens to be one of your favorite movies. And that movie is The Prince of Tides.
I've always loved The Prince of Tides, which, if you know me, it's not my typical watch. I like fluffy. I really enjoy a movie that has a happy ending. But there's something so powerful about that story, and it has always stuck with me. And there are a couple of things that are said in there that are very true and applicable in this situation. One of them is, at one point, the lead character says, the silence is worse than the event that happened to him, the trauma that happened. And I think that's why this podcast is so important. We need to talk about it. God meant us to live in community. Forcing a trauma victim to be silent is worse than what has actually happened to them. So the first thing I would say is listen. And the second thing that has always stuck with me from that movie is Barbara Streisand's character says, you were her memory even then. And this is her as a child, and her brother was her memory, because once she had been traumatized, her memories were jumbled at best. And so forever he had been a memory keeper for her. And I, from the very beginning, as things unfolded with you, Amy, that movie and that line had always stuck with me. And I took it to heart, like the Lord had said, that this is going to be your role. You will be a memory keeper. You will be her memory, and you can be helpful in that way. I didn't understand the science of it, but I knew that there was a hiccup, because I know you, right, and you're very smart, but the lapses in memory did not make sense with the person I knew. And so I have become your memory keeper.
Even today, with little things, and we'll go back to this for in a minute, but you were a significant memory keeper, better than a journal, probably better than things I actually wrote, right? Because I was writing things that I remember. But what is so powerful to me about that quote in The Prince of Tides, and we're not telling you what the event is because it's a great movie and you should go watch it, and we don't want to be a spoiler. But the silence is worse than the actual event. And one of the things is that you, along with other people, refused to let me be silent. And so as I told that story about living with you, I remember the first time I came into your house and I put the key in the door, and how weird that was, because I had come from being married for 12 years and then living in what I dubbed as the ghetto to your house. And I just remember how weird that was, but you really refused to be silent on the issue. And I've always appreciated that. You have an incredible sense of justice, but I've always appreciated that. Now, you and I have a really funny thing going on, and it's actually taken on a new life, even with our counselor, with me being a wordsmith and you having a word budget. But we came up with a word that works for both of us, and it basically is a ceasefire a lot of times for us. We call it trauma brain. Tell them what we mean by trauma brain.
If they escalate unusually, like if you're getting in an argument and suddenly someone's ready to drop a nuclear bomb.
Or push a fire extinguisher off the wall.
Correct. Or throw coffee against a wall.
Oh, right.
Right. Then what I try to do, knowing that whatever is firing in your brain, or could be in mine, is off. Right. It's off. It's firing on a million cylinders instead of one.
Right.
Then I try to bring my voice down, and I think we both have decided, okay, hey, trauma brain, and say it laughingly. If that doesn't work, then I say it soothingly. We try different ways of getting through all those firing cylinders that are saying, I can't handle it. Throw all the nuclear bombs, throw all the bombs. I can't deal. Whatever can get through. So if it's calm, if I can say, hey, I think this might be trauma brain, or if we need to say, hey,
this is trauma brain.
Either way, whatever way we need to, the key is to hear the person and not the argument.
And
that's
huge.
You really do need to be paying attention to when, especially someone who has complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is picking a fight and by picking a fight, I do mean that this is not intentional. It is a defense mechanism because their brain is literally thinking, I could die.
I've got to survive.
Yeah. This is fight or flight.
Right.
And so it is literally, we could fight over the color of the floor.
100%. And we have.
Yes. And screaming. And so you've got to back yourself out of the situation and recognize that there is something else at play. And we're at the point now where I can say, okay, something else is bothering you. And oftentimes you're getting to the point now where you can say, I don't know what it is.
Right. And that's half the battle.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge.
One of my favorite things that you say, and I would as Chrissy is speaking to people who love survivors of post-traumatic stress disorder and people living with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a couple things. One of the things that you say to me all the time, and it is absolute, like somebody just gave me a shot of a tranquilizer because it calms me down. Because one of the issues with the amygdala and the hippocampus is everything. I don't have the ability to de-escalate stress, right? So we just came off of, we're in the middle of a pandemic or towards the end of a pandemic. But what a lot of people don't know is that, as I mentioned early in the podcast, you're my business partner and we've been in business for 10 years together. And when that happened, my brain shut down, 100% shut down. And so it's a trigger. And so you live, unfortunately, with triggers. And I often apologize to you. I'm sorry, or I'll say something like, this is my broken brain. When you hand me your phone and go in the car and go, do I turn right or left or north or south? You know better because those things don't happen. But one of the things that you always say to me that just brings me to a place of safety and not feeling like I'm backed in a corner and not feeling like I have to defend myself is you will say, you're not okay. You just use those words. You're not okay. And first that really made me mad, early on that really made me mad because, of course, I was okay. I've been okay all these years. I'm successful. I get up in the morning. I got up in the morning, even though I was doing some things that weren't great. That offended me at first, but now it's such a loving thing to say to me is, you're not okay, why not? And you're really good about helping me back up and walk back. Like, this trigger happened. And it's not like the trigger triggers then. Many times a trigger can trigger 3 or 4 days and down the road. And so yeah, I think de-escalating the whole thing and it really takes the 1 Corinthians 13 kind of love to stick with people. I've had people walk away. And so if you love somebody with this much trauma, the best thing you can do for them besides take them to the throne of God is stay. And to Chrissy's point about that quote in that movie that she loved so well, don't be silent. And so you refuse to let me perform my way out of a trigger. You refuse to do all of that.
One of the things that is really important to ask is, tell me what's going on.
Yeah.
And often you may not know what's going on. Even if I can say, hey, I don't think that actually the color of the floor is what's bothering you. Can you tell me what's going on? Tell me about your morning. Mm-hmm. And so even going back into the morning, then suddenly something starts to trigger. It starts to unlayer itself. Well, this morning I got that phone call, but that bothered me because yesterday I got that email. And then suddenly we unpackage and suddenly, well, what's really bothering me is X.
Right.
So tell me what's going on is a very simple phrase, but it seems to work 99% of the time. Tell me what's going on.
Because what I hear is I love you and I care.
Yeah.
And early on...
I want to hear you.
Right. I don't want you to be silent.
Yeah.
Right? Because the silence is worse than what you went through. And there were so many times that we actually had knockdown, drag-out arguments because I will never forget a precious memory. And it must have been around Valentine's Day. And this was when I first moved in with you, and I'm air quoting again for 3 months. But we had those little candy hearts that you like so well. Yep. And you just would not leave it alone. Like, you would not let me not talk about it. And we were throwing those candy hearts back and forth to the room and catching them and making it funny. But I can't stress enough. And Chrissy's one of many people who do this, but because I've done life with her so closely for so long. And again, we're business partners, and we're getting ready to talk about how we met and how I gained a family at 35 years old. Right. And so, but I wanted to have that part of the conversation. And then really that's not scripted, that's organic. But I think that quote from that movie has really framed you. I think that the Lord also really builds some people different. Well, he builds us all differently, but you have an incredible sense of justice. And so some of the funny parts of my story will be when we went to court, actually, and we were all afraid that we were going to get you out of jail. So we know that memories with complex post-traumatic stress disorder as well as PTSD are affected, right? We know that. So one of the things that you said to me in a loving voice, and not that your first podcast sucked, Amy, was, I remember how we met a little bit differently than you do, Amy.
Yes.
And so for those of you who have been listening to all the podcasts, you know my version of how we met. And for those of you who are picking this one up for the first time, you'll hear it in reverse. But this is a very specific example of how my brain and those memories get blogged up. And so we're going to talk about 2 of them today, and this one being the first one. So you tell us the story. Now, before I do this, let me just say that for those of you who met Chrissy, know that you will really be hard-pressed to find a more shy person on the planet. You will be hard-pressed to find a person, she probably could go days without uttering a single word from her voice box. And I, however, am the exact opposite of that. I'm an extreme extrovert, number 8 on the Enneagram. I can't remember what you are, but sure. Quiet is what you are, and shy and introverted. And so I say that because what's coming next, and hopefully I don't remember it all wrong, what's coming next is nothing short of a miracle because you are so shy. So tell the people your version of this beautiful Jonathan and David friendship.
Well, we both ended up at the same Bible study.
That part is true.
That part is true.
Okay.
However, Amy remembers it that we met at that time and we did not meet at all. We were in the same Bible study, but it was large enough that we never actually met. I did not know her name. I just saw her. And then the school year started. She started teaching. I started coaching. And all of my students, players, kept saying, we have this new teacher. She's awesome. She's so cool. Did not know a name. I started going to Sunday school, and this person was in there, still no name and no name attached to the new science teacher, which is what the students called her instead of my name. There was just the new science teacher. She's so cool. It's new science teacher. So the very first time I talked to Amy was after she led our group that day. And I went up to her and had to wait 185 minutes for everyone else to talk to her. And I sat there quietly and then went up and said, thank you so much for sharing. It meant so much, blah, blah, blah. That's the first time. And then I said, I think that you teach and I coach, and I think we have some of the same students. At which point we began to talk Sunday mornings a little bit about our students or go to a basketball game together or whatever. The memory that you have where we really clicked was not until that December, and that part of the memory is correct.
That part is true.
Yes. Okay. But by that point, we had actually been friends for a while.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah. But that memory stuck, and it was a pivotal moment because we talked about football and about Maine, and you had just gotten out of the hospital.
And let's talk about that just for a second. That was not the psych ward, that the story that people have heard. I was having some heart issues. Yeah.
And so I knew there are some things that I'm good at, even in my shyness, and that is that I can dive in. And so when it's a deeper topic, I knew that I had some things I could talk to you about. And so after that, you said, let's go to lunch. Once we had lunch, it was game on. We became friends. And so that would have been December, January. And from then on, from January through May, was our epic California road trip.
Awesome.
Which was so awesome.
Chris drove the PCH highway and I didn't die.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was so beautiful. So in those 5 or 6 months is when we really, really bonded. And it was that at that time that I said, I did call my mom and I did say, hey, I'm thinking about asking Amy to come move in with me. And she said, great, make it a set amount of time, 3 months, for her sake as well as your own, so that you don't hurt your friendship. And so I did. I invited you to move in for 3 months, fully knowing that it was not going to be just 3 months.
I kind of remember it was a passive ask, though.
It was. That part is an absolutely correct memory. It was hey, I was just thinking, maybe just for the summer, you know, just for a couple of months, it would just kind of get you on your feet again. Why don't you come move in with me?
So it wasn't. I did think we met that night at the Bible study, but clearly we met a little bit later, and I remember a little bit about hearing about the cool volleyball coach and the JV, and I had some of those kids, and so it was really quite miraculous of how we came together. And your favorite subject on the face of this planet, which makes me honored to be your friend, and it makes me honored that you wanted to be my friend that day, is your depth in Jesus. And that's one of our C's is there's no way that I would be here. There's no way you would have been equipped without Jesus. And so I really am so grateful to the Lord for, the opportunity to teach into that Bible study. That really is kind of what hooked you. You're like, I want to be her friend.
Yes, absolutely.
Because she loves my Jesus.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
So, and yeah, we were 100% inseparable. And I was just remembering probably what maybe you experienced as the first, quote, air quote, trigger for me is when we went to San Francisco. I already had a camera and you bought a camera, but I bought a really expensive lens.
Yes.
Because of the time change and all that stuff, I was kind of out of it. Anyway, make a long story short, we went to a restaurant after that and I broke the lens. And it was a disproportionate response to breaking the lens, to say the very least. Do you have any memory of that? Because I think it speaks to some of this hypervigilance when things like that come up in response to stress.
Yes, it was. I mean, honestly, it was such an overwhelming, almost a fear. And I think that it was so close to the domestic violence.
Okay.
That would have been, I think that I knew at that moment that I needed to do whatever it was to help solve it for you. So the first thing was, we'll go buy a new one. It's no big deal. It's not a problem. It's no big deal. We'll just buy a new one. But as we looked at it, we realized that the only thing that had broken actually was just the UV protector on it.
Right.
And it turned out that it was not broken, and that was a gift. But in that moment, the only thing I could do is take it out of your hands. You're okay. I'm okay. We can get another one. It'll be all right. Anything to sort of to break through the moment.
And neither of us had a clue what PTSD even was at that point.
Not at
And
that moment.
You barely knew me.
I knew you had suffered. It didn't take a diagnosis for me to understand that you had had a lot of hardship. And so I knew that the best thing I could do for you was help you understand that this is not the end of the world. This is a lens. We can get a new lens, or we can cry over this one, but it's okay. You're not in trouble. And I think that was the key, is no one's angry.
Yeah.
No one's upset with you.
Yeah.
You didn't do anything stupid. You're not an idiot. And those were the things that I was trying to break through, is I felt like you were A, afraid, and B, thought, I'm so dumb.
Yes. Yeah. I was so mad at myself because that lens was so expensive. And yeah, I think looking back on it now, the response from my ex-husband would not have been good.
Clearly.
Clearly. And so I think that was maybe one of the first times but what I've always wondered, and I've asked you this question over the years in so many different forms, and I don't know that you can articulate it, because there's some things that the Lord just does and we say, okay, some of the people listening to this, and some people that we both know and love who are mutual friends of ours, if at all you could articulate, why me? Why did you choose me? In the 13 years that I've known Chrissy, I've never asked her that question. Her response to me didn't really surprise me, but her response to me deserves more time than we would have in the podcast, as I want to be respectful of your time. The verse that I referenced in my conversation with Chrissy is John chapter 15, verse 13, although I'm sure it's found in the other three Gospels, where the Bible says, "Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friend." And of course, we know that ultimately Jesus laid down his life for us, friend of sinners. And so sometimes when we read that verse, we think of literal laying down our lives for our friends. And certainly that is definitely a friend, without question. I think we all would agree with that. But laying one's life down oftentimes means carrying those person's burdens along with them. And I feel the importance to mention this to you because what Chrissy did for me, and the parts of the story that you've already heard and parts of the story that you haven't heard, is a little akin to if you were on a hike with a friend and you both have backpacks and your the goal is to pick up unique rocks, and you're hiking up the mountain. And one friend sees that the other friend is struggling, and so they start to put their rocks in their backpack just for a little while. And that is really a snapshot of living out, laying down your life for a friend. During a time when I still needed to hike, I still needed to live, Chrissy was the person that God called to take my rocks and put them in her backpack just for a little while. I do think it's important to note that it is super risky, for lack of a better word, in situations like this, because we have an enemy who does not want healing to occur, and certainly doesn't want us helping each other heal. And so it's really important in close friendships like this that you guard against the enemy. You guard against leaning on each other too much, making sure that Jesus is still the star of your story, making sure that you are pointing each other to Jesus. And so while Chrissy very practically came alongside and continues to even to this day, she is not more important than the star of the story. She happens to be a player that the director, the great producer, Jesus, has decided to put into my life. But it is super important and something that we make sure that we do just in the way of taking care of our friendship, is making sure that we're staying on the right side of that. I think in situations with PTSD, and particularly with stories like mine, there can be a tendency, and I hate to use that word because I don't feel like that's true here, but there can be some opportunity for codependency to enter in on either side. So it is really important for those of you under the sound of my voice who are walking along with someone with PTSD, or even if you are the patient, that you remember that that person is put into your life to be a player, but not to be the star. And it's really important that you guard against some of the things that the enemy wants to bring into the story, thereby really destroying all the good that has been done. Chrissy will be with us for 2 more podcasts. We thought that it would only be 1 and then 2, and it turned into 3. And the Lord really just continues to be in the place of telling this story and helping people with PTSD. As always, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform streaming service. If you are so inclined, leave us a review. Those are always helpful. Throw us a couple stars if you're so inclined. All of those things help us come up when someone is researching this topic, particularly if they're researching a Christian worldview on the topic of post-traumatic stress disorder.
As the years go by and the days get lost in time, wherever you go, you will always know I'll walk with you to the other side.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Wednesdays with Watson. By now you know that my name is Amy Watson, and I am your host. And this is our first season, our inaugural season of the podcast that we have called PTSD, Jesus, and Me. This is a story of my journey, my diagnosis, and my healing even today, so that we can provide hope for those of you out there who are suffering from PTSD or love someone who is. I continue to focus on the star of my story, which is none other than Jesus, and the way that he has provided for me, and the 3 C's, my community, obviously my church, and trauma-informed counseling. Today we're going to focus a little bit more on that community portion of it as we sneak back into a conversation that Chrissy and I had over the course of about 2 hours. We've named these episodes Memory Keepers because one of the hallmarks of PTSD is the inability to remember things clearly, congruently, concisely, and sometimes correctly. And so, welcome as we join back into the conversation that Chrissy and I had where we left off last week as Chris was explaining some of the more difficult portions of loving someone with PTSD and the necessity to do some hard things, including seek help yourself as the person who is in support of the patient. So sit back, relax, and sneak into this conversation with Chrissy and me. If at all you could articulate, why me? Why did you choose me? Why?
I think that at this point you recognize that the Lord gives me some instincts.
100%.
And I can't say that it's me at all. It's only the Lord. So there's no sense in bragging on it other than to say he's given me a gift of instincts. And I just knew. That's really all I can say. Sometimes there's just that instinct. And I felt like that's exactly how our whole family was. I don't remember anybody talking about, hey, Amy should be part of the family. It was just, she's just part of the family. There was never a conversation. It just happened. And I think that all of us just felt that rightness and that this was part of the Lord's story. You just naturally fit in. And that's so highly unique and improbable and all of those words. It could only be the Lord. And
now some of those people would pick me over you.
yes, yes,
on any given day. I do agree that you've got that gift of instinct, but I know that, what's so precious to me about this and about Cheryl and about Chris. Now, you and Cheryl were new, right? So y'all come onto the scene in my heart and this part of my story probably more prevalently than people who had already been on the scene. But it feels like, even talking about it 12 years later, it feels like the biggest hug from Jesus. Like, you know what? I got you. And I'm going to use the church, and I'm going to use the community, and they're going to be the body. As I mentioned in the last podcast, I moved back to Clearwater where I went to college, and I didn't have a family. And so I it'd be one of the first things I'm going to ask Jesus after, that Mercy Me song. I can promise you one thing I will say is, why me? I don't feel worthy of this family, of this love, and of this unconditional friend who has been through so much with me. And so it's a good transition for us, because perhaps one of the most traumatic things for all of us involved, you, me, and Cheryl combined, is that admission to the psych ward. Yes. And so I had only lived with you for about 3 weeks at the time. 14 days. Back to the memory issues. I had only lived with you for a few weeks. Did you notice anything different during that time that I lived with you, those 2 weeks, from the time when we were friends that summer?
Yes. So when you moved in, one of the first things that I had noticed that I would come over and just in the morning say, hey, how are you, and everything. And you would say, I'm having flashbacks at night. And I really was like, I'm sorry. I didn't know what a flashback was, other than I thought basically what I heard is I'm having nightmares, right. Which was like, oh, okay, well, me too. and then the only other thing that I very specifically remember you saying is, some days it's hard just to get dressed and get ready for school. And you don't tend toward the depression. And so that was unusual. And that was probably the actual only warning flag I had, because again, I thought flashback meant nightmare. So to some degree, I pushed that to the side.
Right.
The only clue I had was that I was like, well, is she tired? Is she struggling? That was it. And it was like 2 days later that you were in the hospital. So you did have one counseling session, as you mentioned, with Dr. Pettit prior to being hospitalized. And I do remember you coming to me after that first session and saying that he said it would get worse, way worse, before it got better. And one of the reasons I remember that is because I was shocked. I had no idea.
You thought counseling was going to fix it all.
Yes. I thought that, like having surgery, the healing would immediately begin. And once you got the antibiotic or whatever, that this counseling, once you started going, life would get good. And not just good, great. Right. It would all get better. And that it would get worse was so...
So you started the 3-month countdown at that point. Like right. My mom was right. She only needs
3 months. So, but that was a Friday, and on Wednesday you were in the hospital. So it was that fast.
So let's set this up for a second. I posted a picture on my Facebook page of Cheryl and me, which ironically we didn't have any. So she brings, my memory is, I'm pretty sure this part is right. I went down and talked to Aaron, the assistant principal, and he brought Cheryl. She shows up with me to get some clothes before they take me to the hospital. And tell us what she said to you.
She pulled me aside and said, did you know? And there were a lot of things going through my head. One was, of course I didn't know. If I knew, I would have told somebody. But the real thought was, oh man, should I have? Am I stupid for not knowing? And so for other people who are living with people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, or even if your friend is in a domestic violence situation and you didn't know,
it's okay.
It's okay. Don't feel stupid. Yeah. The key is let's move forward. and help one another, but I felt so dumb that I didn't know. I had no clue.
Well, and you're a fixer, and so
I'm a
it's
fixer, but more importantly, I cared. And I couldn't believe I didn't see any warning flags, and I didn't see one.
We didn't know each other. I mean, we had known each other for about,
But it's really, honestly, there have been times over the years that I've known you for years, and there were things there are times you just don't know, and it's okay to just miss the clues.
Right.
Sometimes we're just going to miss the clues, and that's okay.
And again, why we're doing this.
Yeah.
Because we want people to know, we want you to at least ask the question internally. And because while we're all born evil, I do believe there are more good people in this world than bad in terms of wanting to help like you did.
Absolutely.
And so there are some of you out there are going to be listening, and the chances of you coming upon somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder is going to be high. Yeah. And everybody's going to operate differently. You are called to a very specific part of my life. Yes. Now, you came to see me every day in the hospital, and that was interesting.
Yes, the hospital was, it was hard. It was hard.
Talk to us about that a little bit. Some of this I'll hear for the first time.
When I would come in there, it was just hard. But it was about the fifth day. And I knew they had said all you had to do was eat. And I said, go eat. And they'll let you out of here. And they did. And that was the day you came home. And again, being the rainbows and butterflies, I was like, well, we've been to the hospital. It's all going to be good from here. Yes. Yeah. One of the things that has been coming to mind for me in community is it's not just the person with PTSD who is going to be traumatized.
Amen.
So I equate it to if you're a parent and your child is raped, the child is clearly the one who has been traumatized. Right. But as a parent, you're traumatized too. So recognize that.
And get your own help.
Get help. One of the things that has been so helpful for us is that we did have the same counselor.
Right.
If that isn't possible, at the very least, I would recommend that you do some joint sessions so that you can discuss and understand what are some things you can do to communicate better, to understand the situation.
So far, none of my memories have been lies or inaccurate or made up or any of those things, as is sort of somewhat common, particularly in younger kids. They'll remember it differently, and it really sometimes just never happened. So the last podcast I talked about going and filing for a domestic violence order of protection and leaving at sunset and driving over a bridge. Just because everybody can use a laugh, why don't you tell us what I did in that situation?
When we left the hospital on day 5, it was not sunset. There was no bridge.
I think she's wrong on that, guys.
No, it's absolutely correct because I know where the hospital is. There are no bridges. We drove home in traffic. It's not a pretty part of town necessarily. It's just.
So what do you suppose I'm remembering there?
I think that your memory wants to paint some positive to what is a hard memory.
Wow, that's
so
powerful.
Putting it at sunset over a bridge as I'm telling you the very hard news is your brain's way of saying, here's some hope in some very horrible news. I was supposed to keep a secret from you, and it did not work out.
So let's talk about what's secret for those of you that might need to go backwards. And so on day 5, when we finally decided that if I ate, they'd let me out of the hospital. And by the way, this is a good place for me to tell you that oftentimes eating disorders are also the byproduct of post-traumatic stress disorder, something that I still struggle with today. And so when they let me out on day 5, you had some information along with Cheryl and Michelle.
And I had reached out to them.
So I'd gotten some emails. So yes. tell us how you found those emails. And
well, while you were hospitalized, you didn't have any electronics.
Right.
And so you had said, can you just keep an eye on my emails and make sure that I'm not missing anything major? As I did that, I got those emails.
And so the emails that she's referring to is I had been divorced for about 18 months. And they were awful emails.
Yes, they were systematically more and more threats. So I reached out to Cheryl and Michelle and said, okay, what do I do? And the first thing they said is, okay, well, Amy's in the hospital, so the only thing we would say for sure is
don't tell her.
Don't tell her the second she gets out of the hospital. At least give her a chance to get home and get settled. And I mean, this has already been traumatizing enough for her. And I was like, absolutely. Good point. I will not tell her immediately. I'll let her get home and get settled and sleep and eat and just sort of get settled in and feel okay. We left the hospital.
We crossed the bridge at sunset when we left the hospital.
Right.
Yes.
The fake bridge and the non-sunset. As soon as we left,
it was pouring down rain, and then we were on the mainland.
So it's not 2.5 minutes later, and Amy looks at me and goes, okay, what's wrong? Because I have zero poker face, and Amy, who is just coming out of the hospital and is, they've probably given you a handful of drugs already.
Oh, for sure.
Already recognized.
For the ride home, dude, over the bridge.
With my horrible poker face. Even Amy could tell that I was holding something back. And of course, then I just blurted out, and John sent you these threatening emails. So I was not able to keep the secret from you. It was not that day that we went to the courthouse.
It was the next day.
It was the next day.
Jumbled memories, right?
Memories.
Now, it doesn't help that John Watson gave us plenty of memories
to get mixed
to
up.
Combine. So the next one we go home,
right?
And I'm not sure if I sleep that night or not. I don't remember. Yes. We knew that we had to go file for a restraining order the next day. And I've also had to do that 3 times. And so in the last podcast, I combined some memories.
Yes.
One of the things, and I want to make sure that this is an accurate description, that I do remember about that first time in Pinellas County, so in Clearwater, not where we live now, they made me fill out paperwork. And in that paperwork, from childhood to that day, I had to tell them every time I had been sexually abused, physically abused, and then certainly there was a whole other sheet where I had to talk about the marital abuse. And I remember that stack of paper being fairly thick. The thing I remember being the most traumatizing about that is they wanted me to document every hit, every punch from John.
Yes. That part I do remember specifically because it took a lot of time and it was very difficult. And you did have to be very specific. And it was important for the case that you trudge through and do it diligently. And so I sat there with you and continued to prod you. Hey, you got to tell. Is that every time? You have to keep telling more stories. And that was very hard.
Yeah, because there were words that I had to use on that paperwork, like rape, that you don't anticipate in writing in context of a marriage.
Correct.
And so I remember leaving there fairly traumatized.
Again. After having just been in the hospital.
After just been in the hospital.
Very hard. Yes.
And then about that time is when I received the phone call from David Kilgore, who said, hey, teachers have decided to give you enough time so you can take another 30 days off. Yes. And then this was the October that my car insurance went up exponentially because I had 3 car accidents. Am I remembering that properly?
That is correct. Okay. Now the paperwork that we filed, that's all correct. But the person who was rude was not there.
I blamed the wrong person. That was another time when I had to file.
Another time and a different person.
So this person was pretty nice.
It's a different process there. And so I do not remember a person at all. I just remember handing in the paperwork.
And then we went away for a couple hours and they came back and I was granted the restraining order and a court date.
Temporarily.
Yes. The temporary restraining order and a court date. Yes. Which, of course, the court date, for those of you who are listening who may have experienced domestic violence, that's traumatic all in itself. And so about that time, after filling out that paperwork and them making me effectively write with my hand and my memory every time over 12 years that I had been hit, knocked, punched out, and all of those things was incredibly traumatic. So I go into 30 days of intensive outpatient therapy. I have 3 car accidents, and now is the time when I would normally tell the listeners about the court date. We went to court. So we went to court, and it was you and me and Chris DeWitt and Michelle and Mama Bootsy. I think that was all that was there. We filled up pretty much a whole bench. And we walked in, and again, this lady walked up to me and said, "Hey, I'm an advocate. Do you have any questions?" And I didn't feel real supported by her at all.
I didn't think we needed support.
No, we didn't know what we were doing. You know?
I mean, it felt like cut and dry. He threatened your life.
Yeah.
I win.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. It felt like, why am I even here?
Right.
Can I not just phone this thing in?
Yes.
You know, they didn't let us phone it in.
Right.
You know,
No.
that time anyway. No. And so we went to court. We didn't know that they go by it. First of all, the people with attorneys get heard by the judge, and then they go through the alphabet. So we're sitting there, and of course, John at the time is living in St. Augustine. And so every minute that goes by that he doesn't come in, we're like, this one's in the bag. This is a slam dunk. He's a wuss. He's all bark, no bite. He's not going to show up. We're good. And had my name been Adams, that might be the case. Because we were sitting in that bench, and I will never forget hearing those court doors open. And I looked back and saw him for the first time since I left him. I have a lapse of memory at that point, which you can fill in a minute. I remember just being like, it was a seriously oh crap moment. And then it was my turn to go up and I couldn't hear the judge. And so he was way far from me and I couldn't hear him. Michelle went with me, had grabbed my hand. She's sobbing because she cries when she's mad. I'm terrified. I'm shaking. The only time I've ever been to court was to watch my mom's parental rights get taken away. So yeah, I was terrified. But John walks in with his attorney, and I know this is not going to go well. I've got very little memory of the interaction between John and his attorney and the judge. All I remember is the one word I kept hearing the judge say was, we're going to reschedule this because this is like a Zamboni. This is not a level playing field. You need to get an attorney. I had no idea what a Zamboni was, but he told me I needed to get an attorney.
Yes.
And then I don't know why you got so mad and we had to pull you down, and because you literally popped up like the bailiff was going to come get you.
My memory of that is the Zamboni reference was that he said we need to level the playing field.
Okay.
It's not fair. So the Zamboni clears the ice.
Right.
So him having a lawyer and you not, he wanted to level the playing field. It was actually to your benefit. So it was a good judge. It was a good decision that day. The thing that had really ticked me off is he showed up at the last minute, sauntered in, and then his attorney was belittling, was basically saying,
I was overreacting.
Little lady, she's overreacting. Yeah, methinks
thou
protest too much.
Yeah,
That's Shakespeare.
The Shakespeare quote. Yeah.
He put that in the
actual paperwork.
Rebuttal. Yeah,
right.
Paperwork, whatever you want to call that, and was even more condescending when he got up there. So everyone had exited the room for the most part.
And the judge said, go get an attorney,
Yes.
come back December 2nd.
Yes.
And John had to wait while I followed the attorney and the bailiff out to the judge's chambers to get the date. So you were in. I
don't know what made me, other than all
the
of
smirk
the
on his
above.
face, I remember you saying.
He went by, yes, and I think he smirked and I jumped up because I had it. I'd had it. And yes, Bootsy, Chris, everybody was pulling me down. Chris offered to see me in jail if I ended up in jail.
And Mama Bootsy said, I'm claustrophobic, so I'm not coming to see you.
To see you.
Yeah.
I was just so angry. I was so angry because we had just gotten through so much and he had no idea. And I was ticked.
Yeah. And only love can produce that kind of anger for somebody that you didn't know for a long time. And so I know that this is a friendship that the Lord put together. And I remember laughing about that. And I remember Mama Bootsy saying she wouldn't come see you. Mm-hmm. So court was rescheduled by that time.
Yes.
I was going back to work. And the way I remember that restraining order going down, so that temporary restraining order, because I'm going to end this on another hallmark of PTSD, which is silence, because I got silenced in this situation. And the court date came, and you were kind enough to lend me money to hire an attorney. And the attorney was willing to go to bat. And I can't remember whether John broke the restraining order, but somehow he got through to me and said, please don't do this. And so I dropped it.
Yeah.
Tell the people from your perspective why you think I dropped it.
I think that when someone who is supposed to love you, who's taken a vow before God to love you, has harmed you, it makes you question your own value. And in that moment, I think it might have been a last-ditch effort to make him see you as valuable, precious.
All the things he had not.
Exactly,
seen.
because you were giving him, it was more than just dropping a restraining order. He said, I can't get a job. I'm going to lose everything.
I can't find somewhere to live.
You had an opportunity to give him everything, basically. You held all the cards.
Hearing you explain it like that is really like, if I can do something in that case, like you were talking about, I was able to do something for John in terms of he was making it very clear that he couldn't get a job and that he didn't have anywhere to live. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I don't know that I would have answered it that way. One of the reasons why I do the behind the mic video is because I want people hearing the difficult things on the podcast. And you hear my voice, it sounds like, hey, she's great. I want them to see the healing that's occurred. But you've had a front row seat of all of it. In particular, you've had a front row seat of this issue of value.
It is the first battle. Am I lovable? Is there something wrong with me? I don't know that you know that that's the target that is the biggest bullseye for Satan.
Right. Yeah, because he doesn't want me to know who I am or my value in Christ as an image bearer.
Correct.
Or just because I exist, right?
Because you exist.
We as human beings are created for community. We're created to be heard and to be known and to be seen and to be valued. If you would have asked me that question, why do you think you dropped the restraining order? Because it's approach avoidance. I don't like conflict. But I do think at its core it was value. And it was one last-ditch effort for me to say to John by my actions, I love you and I forgive you, and hoping that he would move on. But value is something that might be something that I fight for the rest of my life.
I wonder if it is something that we all will fight all of our lives. I don't know a lot of people who have a really, really good grasp on their value intrinsically from God.
Right.
Not from their job, not from their family, not from being a mom, a sister, just because God made you.
And Satan, to your point, this is the thing that he will attack. And he does not want us to understand that we are made in the image of God, which itself is valuable, period, in the discussion.
Period. Yeah.
And so, this is a hallmark of the human condition, really. Value is the last thing that we pay attention to, and it should be the first, because it's the only way I can own who I am in Christ. And so I'm so glad that you brought that up. Let's talk a little bit more about the reality of flashbacks and night terrors. Probably the most prevalent hallmark of post-traumatic stress disorder. You're unable to differentiate between time and space. And so I would wake up, and sometimes still do, wake up, and it's 1978 in that dark room with that serial killer abusing me.
Right.
And when you're in the early parts of healing a post-traumatic stress disorder, I was unable to say it's 2008. I'm at Chrissy's house in Clearwater, Florida. I'm 36 years old. I'm safe. I know that you were hearing me, or somehow you knew I was having PTSD. I was having flashbacks. I don't know that we knew what they were. And the hospital had diagnosed me with PTSD, but I still didn't believe them. I asked Dr. Pettit years later.
I understood it. At this point, I'm cluing in.
So I'm in denial.
So you're still in denial. I'm cluing in, and I'm talking with Dr.
Are you
Pettit.
researching? So you're talking to Dr. Pettit?
I'm talking to Dr. Pettit about it and trying to understand flashbacks. How do I help? And those types of things. And so I started out with my door open, and it was a split design, the house was, and so we were across the house from each other, but I left my door open to listen for you to go help. And then I ended up in the living room to try to be closer so I could hop up and help. And by the end of it, I ended up in your room. There was a recliner in that room, and there was just no way for you to heal without somebody literally there. There was just too many years of trauma. At the point I met you, it was really 35 years of pretty solid
31 days or 31 years of trauma.
Right. So there, and you had hit a rock wall by the time you had gone to the hospital. And so we were in the middle of you dealing with it. I'm not saying that every situation is going to call for
Somebody being in the room.
However, if your child has recently been harmed,
right,
it's highly likely this may be your solution.
Certainly. And my case is there's more trauma than normal. I also want to know for people who are listening, clearly you leaned on the Lord. Clearly you leaned on the wisdom of your mom and Dr. Pettit,
yes,
who kept it real for you.
Yes.
At one point, Dr. Pettit said to you, Chrissy, I only want her to have to breathe, eat, and hydrate.
But your job was only to breathe. My job was to help you eat, to hydrate you, to do your laundry, to gas up your car, to take you places. Literally at that point, it was life and death.
Yeah, 100%.
We were at that point. It was an extreme situation and called for extreme measures, which meant your brain was so taxed that literally to get everything to calm down, the requirement was, hey, her job is just to breathe. Just keep breathing. And so I was able to do that. I mean, that's, for me, that's easy.
You've been preparing your whole life for that.
Right. So I did everything else.
Yeah.
And it was fine.
Were you leaning on people in our life group?
I would say that one of the hard things in these situations is still the silence on my part. I didn't feel like there were a lot of safe places for me to share.
Wow, that's good.
And
I mean, that's not good, but that's a good word.
Yeah, I think that it's not easy stuff to talk about. It wasn't mine to share.
Right.
So I had a big problem. I couldn't share your story without your permission. And at that point, I didn't have your permission. You didn't want, clearly, to go blast out to everybody what was going on. You were barely making it. You were just breathing.
Were you ever scared that I was not going to make it?
Absolutely. Every day I assumed for the first, and honestly, I would say the first year of our friendship, so post hospitalization, that next year, every day, I assumed that you would not make it. I assumed that this was a gift, that I had a short-term friendship with you, and that the Lord had given me a moment with you, and that it would be very short-lived. Wow. I did not think he would make it.
And, looking you in the eye, which of course they can't see, but looking you in the eye, that's hard. And the first words that I wanted to say were, I'm sorry. But what I am going to say is thank you. Perhaps one of the coolest things about doing this podcast is experiencing conversations like Chrissy and I are having, and you are actually getting to hear. It was a conversation where we sat down and really just tried to organically chat through some of these things that both of us have been through in this journey with PTSD. What's so cool about it is to actually see personal growth, whereas I'm able to thank Chrissy for helping me instead of apologizing or feeling like I need to overcompensate for it. We mentioned value quite a bit at the end of this podcast, and that is something that we will probably devote an entire podcast to. But Chrissy's answer to that question was interesting to me, and my response at first would have been a response of a couple years ago where I apologized, for putting her through some of the things that she walked with me. But instead, I got healthy enough to thank her for walking with me through it. I got healthy enough to thank her for continuing to remind me of my value, and I'd like to remind you of yours too.
Never gonna let you down. Never gonna let you down. Never gonna let you down. Oh, never gonna let you down.
Hey guys, it's me again, and we are still in 2024. Thank you for listening to these throwback episodes of the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. We would love it if you subscribe to the podcast. You can do that right there in your app. Wherever you are, you can follow us, a check mark at the top right-hand corner of Apple Podcasts, and then just write in other apps. You can just follow or subscribe and help the show grow. As we go into September, we'll be having new content, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, and a new format as well as I get closer to finishing my doctorate degree. One more thing by means of housekeeping, if you are so inclined, the Patreon link is in the show notes, and so if you want to support what we're doing here, which is to help people who cannot afford counseling, please just click on that link and you can support us for as low as $5 a month, as many of my listeners do. And so until 2 weeks from now, when we bring you some more throwback episodes, I want you to remember what I always say, and I never leave a microphone without it. You are seen, you are known, you are heard, you are loved, and you are so, so valued. And ask yourself today, can you answer the question in the affirmative, just like I can? Has he been faithful for all of your life?
When it feels like the road's too hard and the distance between is too far, when your weary soul needs a hand to hold, I'll walk with you to the other side. Oh, as the years go by and the days get lost in time, wherever you go, you will always know I'll walk with you to the other side. I'll walk with you to the other side.